Okay, there we go. Everybody has to unmute and agree to the thing so that we can do the thing.
I've agreed.
Aha!
I agree.
I don't think we actually have to say it. I think that, Teams is fine with us just unmuting and then... I mean, I appreciate it. It's good to be clear.
Now it's about
Definitely is.
All right, here we go. Welcome back to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. You've got a few returning voices and also one new voice this week. So just going around my screen here, Zach Wolcher is back. Hello, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going all right, hopefully for you too. And Mr. Andrew Wintermeyer is also back with us. Hello.
I am indeed back, and Cully, glad to be back. Glad you're having me here.
Yeah. And joining us new this time is Dustin Gugwe, who is another member of our customer success team. Hello, Dustin.
Hello.
And I'm Kenneth Cooley, system support lead at Verve Industrial, and still running this podcast for another month. All right, so this episode, I initially had a completely different topic in mind, and then Dustin and I got roped in on some troubles that a particular client was having regarding logs. And logs are like the most boring thing, being primarily inert and composed of wood. No, I'm sorry. But terrible joke. But
They are. They really are.
yeah, terrible joke. But yeah, logs in the digital form are also typically quite boring, being composed as they are of walls of text. That is mostly meaningless until it isn't. And we were having an issue with a customer who was having just a tremendous influx of logs. Now, the thing about logs is, while they are mostly boring, and most of what's in them is, unless you really, really need it, utterly meaningless. But when you need it, it is some of the most meaningful stuff imaginable. And it's for these reasons that being able to capture and look at logs is considered a fairly important aspect of digital forensics, because the logs will tell you a lot about what happens on a system. And in the really, really complicated cases, when the logs are missing or have obviously undergone some sort of out-of-band change, that also tells you something. But in this case, the issue was that the customer was seeing an influx of a very particular kind of log, or a couple of very particular kinds of logs having to do with authentication, failed logins, things like that. Now, when you see that kind of traffic, that also has significant forensic value because it can point in the direction of malicious activity on the part of a user. But it can also point in other directions. And in the course of trying to troubleshoot this, Dustin wound up doing just some absolute amazing work, putting together a very detailed report, going through, well, A, the actual fire hose of log data that was coming in, but then also B, plucking out a bunch of key issues that were probably significant contributing factors to what was happening. And some of the findings out of that were actually really, really interesting. And so, like I say, I initially had a totally different topic in mind for this episode, but then kind of almost at the last minute, I was just kind of thinking about it. And I'm just like, that's actually a really, really keen demonstration of just what the Verve platform can enable in terms of giving the end user, the client, the ability not just to track and manage their assets, although obviously we want that for them too, but then once that's all done, once they've got that system stood up, to use our technology to get to the heart of issues that either are already affecting them or might crop up within the lifetime of their OT environment. I hope that's a decent enough introduction, Dustin, to kind of what ultimately went on. But yeah, why don't you fill us in a little bit, just kind of broad strokes, paint us a picture of exactly what we were getting looped in on when it came to the initial support ask.
Sure. Honestly, when we were first presented this problem, I thought it was going to be because it sounded very familiar. I've had this happen with another customer or two, and so that was my first instinct was to check for these. Primarily, because we have a standardized logging volume dashboard from the Verve platform. So any one of our customers, especially if they're new, have access to this right away as long as logging is enabled. But the first thing I like to do is pick a specific time frame, usually like the last 30 days. And the first thing I look at is this visualization that we have that is their average events per second. And usually anything above, I want to say, even just like one event per second is pretty excessive. For them, we were able to find in the last 30 days roughly over 3 events per second, roughly 7.8 million logs within 30 days, which is a wild amount for what I understand, a small amount of sites that they were pulling from. So something was clearly either wrong or there was just a lack of filtering of the event codes that were coming through from the logs that were being collected. But it was honestly, it ended up being more than just that. There were a couple of things that were happening at once, including, so a lot of the ones you mentioned before, there were a lot of authentication events that were taking place that were just any log-ons, log-offs, successful or unsuccessful. But we also saw, and another problem that they had brought through, an excessive amount of, actually, I'm going through the notes right now, but they did have an excessive amount of failed logins in addition to just the general logins that were successful. And through that, we were able to kind of pick out which of the specific devices or assets that they had were exhibiting this behavior. And I know it triggered them to take action with these specific devices, and even down to like specific users that we were able to look at in some of these tables that I put in the presentation. Do you happen to know if they were able to remedy some of these since I've been gone, or?
I haven't heard too much back from them in terms of actually solutions and remedies. And I know sometimes it can take a while to dive into an environment and actually start making meaningful changes. But just to back up a little bit. So first off, I mean, obviously we had this set up with them for a while. Verve had been set up in their environment for a while. And so we'd been ingesting logs for a while, enough that, they had a workflow around the log data and they were able to notice the influx, the increased amount of logs. But the first thing that, I want to point out there is that within all that log data that we were ingesting, it was possible, to start filtering out by event type. And that's actually a really important, first step, just speaking forensically. And I mean, I don't have any digital forensic certifications, but it's kind of one of my hobby horse things. If I have some time, I'll usually fire up a class in, Udemy or whatever other learning platform I'm connected to. And I'll start just going through some digital forensics learning, because it is a fascinating field just in general. And to be fair, it's also a really, really deep rabbit hole. And you're definitely not going to be using the Verve platform to do some of the more advanced things that digital forensics can entail, right? We're not going to be scanning a hard drive looking for perturbations in data entropy, trying to find hidden encrypted volumes. That's not, what we do. But being able to take a look at system activity, which is represented in logs, is a really important aspect of developing a forensic understanding of what's happening on a system and within the environment that the system is connected to. And so obviously we've been ingesting logs for a while, which means that, we have a good history of logs that we can filter against, and also that we have the capability within our software to filter based on event type. And every kind of event within an environment has its own unique event type or event ID, right? If it's a log on event, that's one ID. If it's a log off event, that's another ID. If it's a failed or a successful login, those are different IDs again. A shutdown, a startup, all of these different things have their own unique event IDs. And we can go into the log data and begin filtering on those. And more than that, we can identify out of the log data which endpoints are generating the majority of the traffic. Ideally, in a normal situation, there really shouldn't be too many endpoints that stick their hands up. Domain controllers might generate a bit more in terms of like overall logging. But in general, if you have a pretty stable environment and nothing is particularly untoward is going on, everybody should be throwing about the same amount of logs your way. So when you're able to go into the history of the logs and start pulling out endpoints that are particularly chatty, and especially particularly chatty on particular event IDs that you're looking for, forensically significant event IDs, that's a really important investigative tool because it lets you zero in very quickly on where the problem is in your environment. And oftentimes, like that is whether you're dealing with a cyber attack or whether you're dealing with, some sort of misconfiguration that is causing issues within your environment. Being able to quickly zero in on, okay, it's these endpoints, this collection of endpoints right here. This is where we need to focus our efforts, because otherwise you can end up chasing your tail for a good long time, going from endpoint to endpoint, figuring out like, are you the problem? No, you're not the problem. Next. So just, you said all of that in like a sentence and a half, but it is really, really significant that, it's funny too, because when I approached you about this, you were like, I actually didn't think it was that big of a deal. And that's almost like the icing on top is that our platform makes this kind of stuff relatively straightforward, so much so that doing something that's actually like informationally, forensically important like that kind of seems, at least to us who know the software fairly well, fairly trivial, fairly everyday. It's like, oh yeah, I can do that. It's no problem. It's just you click here, there, and there.
I do also want to note that, despite having a background from my academics, in network security and forensics, I wouldn't say I'm well practiced at it, but even I was able to like come up with some of these conclusions by merely using the platform. Obviously it's going to take some time getting familiar with it, but like once you are, like it was, I had ideas and I had goals in mind, and I was able to perform to achieve those goals through just using the platform, even from a standardized dashboard that's just out of the box.
Exactly. And then moving on from identifying the endpoints, you mentioned something else that was fairly significant, which is that you identified particular user accounts that were, because a lot of these were log on, log off type events that we were seeing, failed logons or whatever. And you were able to very quickly zero in then on the particular user accounts that were causing the majority of the issues. And if I remember correctly, in at least one case, the user wasn't at the company anymore. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that came up in a meeting.
Yeah, they brought up. We thought he was still with them, and I pointed it out. Like, well, he no longer works here, so that shouldn't be a thing. So it highlighted a potential issue with maybe like some offboarding that they needed to do with his accounts.
Yeah. And that does happen in OT environments, but this also gets to the question you asked about, have you heard any like progress? Have they made progress on this? And unfortunately, I don't know, but I know that we've kind of mentioned this and riffed on the idea a few times in past episodes, and obviously a lot in other conversations that we've had, which is that in OT environments, it's not uncommon. It's not common, but it's not unheard of to see cases where there are particular pieces of software that have been set up and configured under a particular user account, and then the user moves on. They retire, they get fired, they go to a different department, whatever. They leave the company. And as much as good offboarding hygiene would suggest that you instantly and immediately deprovision that user's account, if they happen to be the user account that is essentially functioning as the service account under which a particular critical piece of software is running, offboarding becomes a much bigger challenge now, because now you can't just turn their account off without taking down something that's critical to your day-to-day operations. But you also shouldn't leave the account up and running. And so what do you do in that situation? And that could be what they're currently trying to work through. I don't know. I haven't had an update on it one way or the other, but I could totally see like that could be a case of that they're trying to work through that. I've been in plenty of facilities in the near 20 years that I've been in OT cybersecurity where that's been the case. Some piece of software has been running under Bob the electrician's user account, except that Bob retired 2 years ago, and now what do we do? It's hard to factor that into your risk score, Zach, but I I feel that's, there's an element there of like, oh, there is actually some risk there.
Yeah. I was actually just thinking about that, like how to quantify that into something tangible, something, that a customer could look at and say, okay, this is where their, risk is. I know within the Verve platform, we have the capability of assigning risk to a particular user, almost kind of like an insider threat type situation where it'd be like, okay, this user has admin privileges, so their risk rating is slightly higher than, other people. So it's things like that kind of help spike the number just a little bit, but that's a really good discussion.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe if you can like assign a user, a particular risk value, maybe that's the way to do it, right? It's like, okay, well, now this user's been offboarded. So now within the risk management system, we flag them as high risk or whatever, like just amp that up. Because, again, you can't necessarily offboard them right away if they happen to be running an important piece of software or a service or something like that. But at the same time, you definitely want to attach some kind of flag to that allows the client to say, okay, like this is a thing that now needs to be on our radar until we can remediate it.
I would almost say like, kind of looking at the old risk math of likelihood times impact. The likelihood of an administrator, doing something nefarious could be very small, but the impact, I think that's where you could dive into something like that, where you could say these users that have admin privileges that, are, starting, I guess, with administrators. Administrators have a certain rating of a high impact, and then are they somebody that's actively utilizing the system, right? So if they're an administrator that only uses or changes or modifies anything once a year, then the impact potentially could be lower because they don't mess with things a lot. But if you're looking at somebody that's in there day after day, if there is something where, this user suddenly, no longer works at the company, somebody being able to privilege escalate into that account would be detrimental, right? So that's something that you'd want to account for. If they're still on, then that's one thing. But how do I phrase this? So if you're an administrator that has all of these privileges, you should definitely have a high impact rating associated with that account. But and that would kind of transfer over where if you're seeing these high impact accounts from like a 30,000 foot view, right? So let's say you have 100 administrators, each of them have a high impact rating associated with them. Those are the accounts that you kind of want to go in and definitely make sure that these people still work at the company. Hopefully that makes sense. Because if they don't, if, in this case, the person has moved on or, whatever, if somebody goes in and escalates into that account and it's still there, like now your likelihood skyrockets as well. So the risk on both accounts is just massive. Hopefully that makes sense, but.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a strategy at any rate, right? Like, and again, something that exists within the platform to allow you to at least better contextualize the actual risk that is attended by giving users high levels of privilege. And then, also the risk factors associated with not being able to remove a user account that you really, really should be removing because of whatever reason.
I think at the very least, like I'm a huge proponent of this, and anytime I do any assessments or anything, I foot stomp the absolute hell out of this. It's change your administrator usernames. You should not have a single administrator with the name administrator or admin or anything that's relevant to that, because there's no this equals that person. Right? If anybody can go in there and just hit administrator, I mean, you have no idea who's actually utilizing that. If this is a person that's been let go of the company, or if this is somebody that's been fired, if this is somebody that's simply hacked into your system and now they're utilizing this administrator account, there's no way to actually have non-repudiation on that person, or no way of actually being able to associate them with with an employee. So that's something that, we still see every now and again, where actually probably a lot more than every now and again, we see it a lot, where there's accounts out there that still have an administrator username. And you can see that there's a lot of other accounts that don't. We had one customer actually that they did have one administrator account, but what they did was actually kind of smart. That was their fallback. So basically, there should never be any activity from that administrator account, because they would be utilizing actual named administrators to do any and all of the work. And then if something were to happen, like they need to go do a password change or whatever, then they could go in and use that administrator account, because it was a default password that was kind of the senior leadership, if that makes sense. But they can monitor that. That was one of the things that they actually set up rules in Kibana or in our tool that specifically said, hey, if anybody ever utilizes this account, send an email out. And then we can verify, okay, this activity was so-and-so changing a password, or so-and-so accessing this system that, they'd gone through the approval process to utilize. So that's definitely something huge, massive foot stomp. Change your usernames.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess it also kind of functions as a bit of a canary then for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the fact that, the client in this case had gone through the process of, at least I think in most of the cases that we were looking at, Dustin, it was named user accounts, or like at least user accounts that weren't just like default. There was some level of non-repudiation that would have been possible there. Certainly in the case of like, oh yeah, that one's left the company. We were able to that was a named account.
I did see one that said administrator, if I recall.
Fair enough. And I think, though, in a lot of cases, these would have been, we don't really know for sure. Like I say, my suspicion would typically fall on like software, something like that. Something has changed. And to be fair, I don't even know if we ever heard back on like what had happened to actually start causing all of these authentication errors. But it could have been something even like, a routine password change, or maybe, it was a case of where the user account was defined as like the login account for, say, a Windows service when it launches, but then maybe it got auto-pruned, right? It gets shut down. You're still going to see authentication events for that account, even though it's locked out, but, or like a password's been changed.
I've been receiving these logs due to some sort of routing of data.
Yeah, or the network changed and all of a sudden the authentication server is unreachable. There's lots of different things that can happen upstream to cause the problem. But end of the day, there was some other change in the environment, not sure what, which caused now all of a sudden all of this authentication to break down. And because it did, or when it did, we were able to leverage the Verve platform to respond pretty quickly and in pretty good detail to identify a lot of the sources of the issue, and then, go one step further and actually sit with the client and say, hey, here is what we found. Here are the, in quite granular detail, here's your particular problem spots, these endpoints, these user accounts. And in a couple of cases, that user is not here anymore. That's a problem. And, again, it's one of those things where working out of your training, Dustin, and then just being as familiar as you are with the platform, you were able to put this together relatively quickly and with probably what seemed like, not a tremendous exertion of effort on your part. That's certainly a little bit above like baseline, but, you kind of just waved it off. I was like, oh yeah, that was easy. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. But, looking at it from a bit of a higher level view, it definitely, at least to my mind, it really demonstrated the value of the platform for performing this kind of, I'll call it tier 1 forensic work. I mean, again, obviously, if you need to get into the deeper, darker corners of forensics, where you're hunting down shell bags or you're actually like looking for encrypted volumes hidden away on a hard drive somewhere, that still requires much more specialized tooling to achieve and achieve well. But for this sort of first pass investigative stuff, tracing an event and trying to figure out what's causing the event, or at least where the event can be localized to, and what some possible causes of it might be, we were right there. And I mean, for you, it was easy, but you also made it look easy, which I think is the more important part.
Pull it up through raw log data.
Yeah, well, and I mean, nobody likes staring into raw log data, but at least, we do have the ability to like index and search and pivot on particular values within the data.
Yeah, very useful in this process for sure.
Mm-hmm. And, the end result is, I do think the client came away fairly impressed, even if they haven't necessarily had the ability to act on it just yet. But, certainly for my part, it was a wow moment. And I'm hoping, well, it was your good work. So you're the one that we should all be appreciating on. But also just, it was a keen demonstration of what the platform can do. And just also, moving out beyond that and into sort of those general lessons learned, like Zach was talking about, and assessing risk and, just good practice. Because again, we do talk about this a lot, how some of the practices that crop up in OT environments, especially around user offboarding and how user accounts are utilized, they can lead to these sorts of issues. Unauthorized or unplanned or unexpected changes within the networking environment can lead to these issues. Changing an account password because policy says you have to change an account password can lead to these issues in an OT environment, because that account could be used by some critical piece of the process to do work, and now all of a sudden you've changed the password out from under it and it breaks. And that's typically way beyond inconvenient. In fact, maybe we were lucky with this client that it didn't actually break anything super critical. It was a lot of log volume, and there was concern around that. But I don't think they didn't mention that it had taken out any particularly important part of their process control setup. And maybe a lucky break for that, because it would have been there would have been a very different urgency if it had. Now, we still would have been able to do the investigation and deliver them the same report, but, just kind of good fortune then that, it didn't seem to do any harm to their actual operations. But,
this is one of those interesting points, though, even though it might not do actual harm to your operations, being able to do digital forensics or being able to automate digital forensics, that's kind of the stuff that happens, under the water. And it doesn't, you don't realize how much it's damaging you until it almost kind of wants to, reveal itself, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's a tough thing. It's a hard thing, but it's good that people like Dustin go out there and discover these things, and then from there we can figure out ways to automatically hunt for those threats and look for those threats, and then notify customers about them, because otherwise it's just kind of happening and you don't know it until it's too late.
Exactly. And that also underscores the importance of having software that is able to keep a watch on the environment like this, which, ours does. Also, having properly configured alerting is important, right? Being able to actually, like with your administrator Canary account there, right? If this happens, then send an alert with this priority behind it. That's, that is also an important component, because, and it also, I think, demonstrates that, this is not like a one and done process, right?
Oh, yeah.
You start with that, start with figuring out what you have. And then once you've got that done, once you have that inventory, now it's a question of, now what's happening with it, right? What is going on there day to day? And what is, kind of normal and expected operations? What are the deviations from normal and expected operations? What are things that happen that we want to be notified about? Visibility, I guess, would be the buzzword that, you might use there, right? You have your inventory. Now you just need visibility into what's happening within your environment, and being able to ingest logs, pivot and search, filter, that kind of information is a critical component of that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just sitting kind of back as a fly in the wall here. Would like to just I just saved the company like literally hundreds of dollars by canceling our password manager subscription, and I changed all of our servers. We're just going to go ahead and use the admin default account, and I mean, I just figure we could go with like the current like season and year. So like, summer 25. No one's going to get that, right? And it'll change every 3 months, and people just know to change it. So. What was going on here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know you did actually you probably recently did have to cancel out our old password manager subscription now that we're on the new one.
Oh, that request actually missed me by just a hair. That was one desk over from me, but we just went through that here. But I was thinking, as you guys were talking about logging and stuff like that, I've worked in other areas of tech, and I've sat on some pretty important financial transaction data transfer lines before, and just looking at what can be found in logs sometimes when you're troubleshooting stuff, logs are such a catch-22. You really do have to like look at what is getting written to those. And then like it's great that we were able to use that for tracing, but also like I always worry when you're looking into logs, like what else are you going to find in there?
Yeah, well, and yes. And I mean, we had a bit of that in this case, right? Because it we went from just log volume, why do we have so much log volume, to, oh, hey, we have user accounts that we really should have offboarded. That is exactly what you're describing there. You go from just looking at something to actually finding something. And sometimes that's a bit scary.
That's a good reminder to, keep up with the simple stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yes. A lot of it does come down to, well, I mean, again, we call it the simple stuff. And in some case, I mean, in some respects, it definitely is, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff is low-hanging fruit. Properly offboarding your users, good password hygiene, all the rest of that is properly, describable as the low-hanging fruit of cybersecurity. And if you can do a lot of those things, you're not going to make yourself unhackable, but you're going to make yourself a harder target. And sometimes that's sufficient. But it can become a challenge, especially in OT, especially in environments where the line between a user account and a service account gets blurred and flagrantly stepped over more than a few times. And there are definitely additional challenges that can crop up with that. Anyway, I don't believe I have a user question. That's okay. But in the absence of one, I guess I will say that is it for this month. You have been listening to OT After Hours, a shorter episode this week or this month, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents, which I think we've gone into fairly well in this little episode. Please do share our episodes with your friends and your family, colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And do please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by myself, Kenneth Cooley. Our opening and closing music is by the ever-so-talented Octo Sound. Look them up if you need some music for a podcast or a video. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Dustin. And thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.